Terri, see if I can remember your bio. Terri has retired now from Lockheed Martin. She was an engineer?
Test engineer.
I started saying test engineer. But she got into genealogy a few years back and discovered, yay and nay, that she didn't really have a lot of American genealogy. Most of her genealogy is immigrant through Canada, France. She has very interesting genealogy, which worked out perfectly since she speaks fluent French. And she volunteers at one of the LDS Family History Centers on Alta Mesa in the Wedgwood part of town. And she does some transcribing of French records for genealogy groups. So without any further ado, we're looking forward to these skeletons in the closet. Did you see my George Bernard Shaw quote up there?
Yeah.
I didn't know if I stole your... Welcome, Terri. Come on down. She's our and teaches our beginners classes. Don't forget that.
Probably going to have to adjust my sound down a little bit.
Maybe because of
A little overwhelming. Thank you, Suzanne. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak again this evening. How many of you have discovered some perhaps ne'er-do-well people in your background? Okay, we're seeing several hands. If you haven't discovered them, perhaps they are lurking in the background. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that you might be able to find them and to determine what their true story is, and perhaps how to share that with others in the family. So, first of all, every family does have some. And when we discover these things and do some research in them, sometimes it helps us to understand better about the circumstances that the family fell into, what forced them to move to other areas, etc. And it gives us that better opportunity to possibly end destructive cycles, come to terms with the truth. So, starting with family lore, how many of you found out about these skeletons by a story coming down? You know, Uncle so-and-so was a horse thief, Grandpa so-and-so had to move west because he killed somebody back in Alabama. Many families have these stories that have passed down as family lore, and you need to investigate them. Are they 100% true? Is there another side to the story, perhaps? So we want to look to see whether your ancestor might have been the perpetrator, or was he or she the victim in a set of circumstances. The biggest thing in terms of methodology is you want to get the proof. Do you want to confirm the story, or do you want to refute the story? And we're going to look at some case studies tonight where there are some iffy circumstances and not necessarily some definitive pointers that say, bad guy. So, and as we do with all of our genealogy research, we want to do it systematically. Start with what you know, and then do the research and flesh out the opportunities to further look at things. One of the tools that I use a lot of is timelines. Construct a timeline. If this skeleton or this person that you are investigating, if you know when they were born, when they married, but there are vast gaps in that timeline, draw it out. See what you can come up with to see how you can fill in those intervening years to see where they might have been and what they were doing at that time. And some of the research tools that are available are our census data, newspaper articles. If you truly have a villain in your family, there's going to be a write-up in the newspaper. Courthouse research, were they brought to trial? Were they condemned to the insane asylum. There are many things that are in the courthouse. And in one case, we'll talk a little bit about land records and how they may shade your decisions. Death certificates and, of course, coroner's reports also will help you if your person might have been the victim of a crime. What is the misdeed that was done in your family? Over the last couple of centuries, especially in the 20th and 21st century, mores and social acceptability has changed a lot, where an illegitimate child was perhaps never spoken of. Nowadays, we see children being born out of wedlock on a pretty regular basis. It does not have the same onus on it that it one time did. So we want to evaluate the life and social times of our ancestors to see how that sin fits in. And if you're planning on sharing the information, you need to be sensitive. Is this someone that is potentially still alive? Is this someone that will affect the cohesion of the family? Is it something that might be very, very destructive as far as family relationships are concerned? So you need to be sensitive about sharing it. So Debbie stole some of my thunder with her posters. So let's look at one of our skeletons. We talked about the societal issues. Here is a list of several of them that might come up, that you might discover in your family history. Then there are also those criminal activities. And then we just have the small rogues and scoundrels, those people that were always labeled black sheep in the family. They may not have committed a really serious crime, but they were always on the edge of something exciting. So we're going to look at some case studies. And the first case study that I have is Agnes Loftus. Family lore said that Agnes abandoned her husband and children to pursue a career on Broadway. So that was the story that came down through the family. And when looking at the 1940 census, number one, we find her in New York State, and she's Agnes Norman. Number one, her name has changed. She's gone from Agnes Ickes to Agnes Norman. Now, you probably couldn't get too many roles on Broadway with a name like Agnes Ickes. So we see where she changed her name. She's only listed as a lodger. She's not listed as an actress or a production assistant or a makeup artist or anything like that. But she is in New York. So there's a little bit of credence when looking into it. So we go back and we look in 1930. Here again, she's in New York. We're also looking at her advanced age. In 1940, she was 67. So probably at the time in 1940, a 67-year-old actress isn't going to be finding too many roles. In 1930, she's 57 years old. She's still a lodger. But in 1920, she's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She's a roomer, and she was listed as an actress. Credence to that family, roomer. She left the family. We cannot find her or her husband in the 1910 census. But we do find her daughter living with her maternal aunt in Salt Lake City. We find her son living in Nebraska with his maternal grandparents. So she abandoned the family, but the children have gone to live with her side of the family. So, what did happen, and where are we going to look? In the 1900 census, the family is intact. Her husband is Horace Ickes, and in 1909, he claims that's when she deserted him. And this is from court records. 1910, as I said, neither one of them is in the census, just the children. So, I told you about making a timeline. Let's look at the husband, Horace's timeline. He was born in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, and when he was 16 years old, the family moved from Bedford County, which is a Amish. It's a very high concentration of Amish in that county, although this family was not Amish. But we see church-going conservative people, and they moved to Sidney, Nebraska. And it's really, Google Sidney, Nebraska, and you will find that it was just a railroad terminus and a cattle town. There were 27 saloons. I found one article that said that there were 80 saloons. There wasn't a single church in the town. This 16-year-old boy is moving from Pennsylvania to a town with 27 to 80 saloons, brothels, gaming houses, etc. And there's a whole list of names for this town. You know, the Wicked Burg, Sinful Sydney, and there was a whole list of them. And we've got one 16-year-old boy moving in. Horace married Agnes in Sydney in 1890, and their daughter was born the year later. And when the railroad veered and went up to the Black Hills because there was Black Hills gold, the town was bypassed. So the family was in the grocery business, but they were forced to move as the decline of the town occurred. Horace moved to Laramie, Wyoming, where he drilled wells. Then he moved to Sterling, Colorado, where his son was born. Then he eventually moved to Salt Lake City, where he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. When the Spanish-American War broke out, he served in the Philippines for that short period of time, comes back to Salt Lake City after the war. And here we see in 1908 that his son William steals and drinks whiskey. It was in the newspaper. So, 6 days later, Horace files for bankruptcy. So, was there family stress going on 6 days prior? That's why he went out and stole the whiskey. So, what is going on in the family household? Horace declares bankruptcy in the beginning of 1909. Agnes deserts him 10 months later. Horace files for divorce. The divorce is finalized. And Horace remains in Salt Lake City until his death. So that's his timeline. Let's look at Agnes's timeline. She was born in Pennsylvania, and her family moved to North Platte, Nebraska. So not that far from Sydney, but at least a more stable community. She married at 17 years of age. And then we find in some of the records, newspaper articles, she's only 17 years of age, but in 1905, that's 15 years later, she's performing in a school play. So she is 32 years old, and she's in school. In 1907, she's 34 years old, and she graduates from 8th grade. Times were different. In 1910, she's working on a high school committee. So this is a 30, almost 40-year-old woman, and she's attending high school. She's listed in the city directories as a student in 1911 and 1912. And as we saw in the census, by 1920, she's in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and listed as an actress. The 1940 census also tells us that she did actually complete 4 years of high school, but she was probably a 30 to 40-year-old woman when she did. So we've got the two timelines of what's going on here. So let's think about it. Horace's life is pretty much on the decline. He loses his business. By 1910, he loses his family. And with that whiskey and default bankruptcy, was he drinking? Did he start abusing his family as a reaction to his negative circumstances? Agnes, on the other hand, is on the rise. She completes her education, and it could not have been easy for her. She had 2 children to raise, and she was a 30-year-old woman, but she did it. She ensured that her children were sent to stable homes, and they were sent to stable homes on her side of the family. So did she leave to escape an abusive relationship and in order to protect her children? As it turns out, while Horace's death certificate does not list alcoholism as his cause of death, both Horace and his son William were alcoholics. And there were many newspaper articles that did point to that. So we're kind of leaning more towards the story where Agnes may not have deserted her family, but sought a way to protect her family. So that's why I say, investigate the case to see, are they the victim, are they the perpetrator, or the victim? So, let's look at some other possible cases for what kinds of ne'er-do-wells we can find. Here is an 1840 Kentucky census, and we have William Adams. And because I can't read, I think he was a trainman. I think he's an engineer. But if you notice, the census taker crossed it out, and he's in jail. So, looking at the census, you may find some surprising details that you didn't know about. So on that particular day in 1880, Mr. Adams was in jail. We do find illegitimate births recorded in, this happens to be a church baptism record, but we notice that this child's name is the same as her mother's name. They are not married. Newspaper articles are going to point to suicides, other negative things. Here's a marriage license, and I thought this was really interesting. Charles Helzer is a resident of the State Prison of Southern Michigan upon his marriage. So what's he in for? You need to do the research and find out. So you may discover some of these things in other records. This is a case of larceny. I love the name. James Henry, alias Bullhead. And he was granted clemency for the particular case that he was brought to trial for, and he turned right around and did the exact same thing again, so that he was sentenced to 7 years sojourn in the penitentiary, not a vacation. So, and this is another case. This is a case of a scoundrel where it turns out that really the scoundrel was the lawyer, not the man that was being arrested. The man that was arrested put up his bail, and the lawyer actually absconded with the bail money. So it was the lawyer that was the scoundrel in this particular case. And then we have something simple as, I love the name, James Henry, alias Bullhead. And he was granted clemency for the particular case that he was brought to trial for, and he turned right around and did the exact same thing again, so that he was sentenced to 7 years sojourn in the penitentiary, not a vacation. So, and this is another case. This is a case of a a man not respecting the Sabbath. He was pursuing his vocation, his occupation, without a license, so that he was arrested. He declined to sign an appearance bond for the same reason. He cited his religious scruples, and that's why he objected, and the constable released him. So, a little vignette, not necessarily a scoundrel. So let's look at another case history, seeing some of the varied places where you can find things. This one happens to be my great-grandfather. He was an Irishman who came over to the United States, and this is a case where I never heard the family lore on this. This was something that was swept under the carpet and never spoken about. This is the 1910 census, and it's very, very difficult to read, but this is a listing of all of the inmates in the Poughkeepsie Mental Hospital in Poughkeepsie, New York, and he is listed as an inmate in the 1910 census. So I'm thinking he's in his late 60s. I find this record. Did he have something like Alzheimer's that might have been, they didn't have that diagnosis then, so I look at it. In 1915, in the state census, he is still also in the Poughkeepsie Hospital. Oops. Picture of the hospital from back in 1918. And his obituary, he died in 1921, and he was in the hospital from 1909 up through 1921, his death. So, looking elementary at the timeline, everything looks pretty negative there. So, why is he in the hospital? In 1910, he's at home. In all of the city directories, he is listed in them. Even after he went to the hospital, he is listed in the city directory as a grocer in Cohoes, New York. I did actually write to the Poughkeepsie Hospital, and in New York State, they changed the law so that if someone had been dead for 65 years or out of the hospital for 65 years, they were permitted to destroy the records. The only record that they were able to send me was an actual death certificate. So, and his actual dates of hospitalization. So that was a dead end. So I started looking at newspapers, and actually, and I have a picture of it, there was an article in the New York Times, which really, really surprised me about why he was in the hospital. He was pronounced hopelessly insane, and today he was removed to the Utica Asylum. I have not had the chance to write to the Utica Asylum to find out if they have any records, but since the New York State law changed, I doubt that they're going to have anything either. Through the spirit of his dead boy, Mr. Cooney claims his movements were directed by God, not Alzheimer's. It's looking pretty negative. And what he was doing apparently was he had written a treatise against the Catholic Church, and he was going to speak on the public square denouncing the Catholic Church. Again, he's 45 years old, deemed hopelessly insane, committed to the asylum. And here's the New York Times article. It was interesting to me that a minister from the Methodist Church paid his bail to get him out of jail. This was a Catholic. Let's see. And he went back. Now, what's interesting here is This actually happened in 1885, many years before he was committed to the institution. The other thing that's interesting on this is my grandmother was born in 1878. So she was 7 years old when all of this was going on in her household, and how did that affect her? So more newspaper articles saying that he was conversing freely and rationally on all subjects. So this is where I wondered, when did the illness start? This is looking at 1885, almost 40 years before his death in the mental hospital. He purchased property in 1864. He and my great-grandmother were married in 1863. So he purchased property in 1864. All the subsequent land purchases that were made in her name. So does this tell me that perhaps his mental illness started even before the 1885 date, and perhaps before my grandmother was even born? So you have to look at the records. I don't have a definitive answer. I truly think he did suffer from a mental illness. One of the newspaper articles swore that he had never had a drink of whiskey in his life. So I don't think that alcoholism was the problem. What is interesting was those land records. And the other thing that was interesting to me, a story that my mother passed down to me, was that before she got married, her mother told her, make sure you always have your own money. So she grew up in that household with potentially a whole negative scenario of her mother having to provide for the family prior to his commitment. So unfortunately, I really do think that he had a mental illness.
Did
So,
his family stay Catholic?
yes, very much so.
They looked down on him for that then.
They tried to prevent, from the newspaper articles, they tried to prevent him. That's one reason that he was arrested. The family banded together to make sure that he wasn't able to do that. So, and there's always, was it the representatives from the Catholic Church who wanted him silenced? Did they play a role in it? I have not been able to find anything that indicates anything along those lines. So that clock is wrong. How am I doing on time?
It's 20 after.
Okay, great. So the other half of my family is Terriers. These French Canadians. And we're going to look at Chappell Meeting. This is a woman, this is a female, and she was born in 1835, and she was the daughter of this particular couple. And in 1852, she got married to Joseph Barabé. Catholic Church records are fabulous. They give, and especially the French Catholic records, they give you births, marriages, and deaths in the church records. And French women never change their name. Their maiden name always follows them through their life. So they are very easy to work with. So we've got her birth, we've got her marriage. But let's see what we find. What this is a legal process against Joseph Barabé and Cesare Theriot, his wife, for the murder by poisoning of Sophie Talbot, the first wife of the aforementioned Barabé. So now we've got a murder case. Sophie Talbot did die in October of 1851, and Joseph and Cesare married barely 3 months later, 2 months later, free. Joseph was 45. Cesare was 16. She was also pregnant. And her baby was born in jail. So, there is the cover letter that I showed you is the trial transcript. So there's a whole bunch of information. There was an inquest, there was an exhumation and an autopsy of the body after Sophie had been buried. Then there was a trial. During the trial, Sophie was enamored with Cesare from the age of 12. He used to go over and visit her father and apparently tempt her with treats. And all of this is in the case history. And witnesses to the trial also claim that Sophie, the wife, did know that an affair was going on. They both were convicted of murder in the first degree, and they were both sentenced to death. Newspapers at the time widely reported that the trial had several inconsistencies, and there were questions raised about the validity of the evidence that was brought into the trial. There was a lot of hearsay evidence, supposedly, and one of the main witnesses to the trial was a 5-year-old child. They questioned him thoroughly as to did he know what truth was. And it's really interesting. They wanted to know if he knew what a sin was. So it was more from that Catholic background as opposed to truth. It was more of a sin.
And how much time had elapsed since she was murdered? Or how much time has she elapsed since she died?
She died in October of 1851, and the trial they married in January 52, and the trial started almost a year later.
So 2 years, so the child would have been 3 at the time.
No, it's 1 year, and he would have been 4 at the time.
Okay.
As the witness. So, and Sophie, when the sheriff or the legal people, they tried to make a bargain with her and say, we'll give you favorable treatment if you admit to what you have done, etc. So there was that aspect of it without being read her rights, quote unquote. And I don't know in 1851 whether they even had anything like that. There was insufficient proof that Barabe was involved in any way, shape, or form. So, because of a massive newspaper campaign, the sentence was committed to life in prison. But what's really interesting about that, she probably served her sentence under house arrest. I have not been able to find anything about prisons for women in Quebec. Joseph died before 1868, and she was out of jail and married another man. So we're talking about 16 years later, and she's marrying another man. They moved to New Brunswick, Canada, and she has 4 more children. So she was convicted based on the testimony. Now, here's the whole family dynamic. 6-year-old Narcisse is the one that's testifying against her. He's the illegitimate son of her father. And he's having a relationship with another woman, Julie Willette. He was married to Adelaide. And Narcisse was born in 1847, and he didn't marry Julie, the mother, until 1859, 12 years later. He's marrying the mother of his illegitimate son.
So Narcisse is her half-brother?
Yes.
The one in jail?
Yes.
That's her half-brother?
Yes.
Who's 6 years old? Okay.
Yes. So the church record records indicate that Augustin had provided proof that his wife had, here we go, perished in the crossing to the north in the fall of 1843 with someone who called himself the Montrealiste, and he had seduced her. How much more? This is like a soap opera. This is the French-Canadian answer to a soap opera. It's the St. Lawrence River. They lived on the southern side of the St. Lawrence River, and she supposedly died, drowned in the crossing from the south over to Montreal, or the north side. They didn't live near Montreal, but so this is on his marriage record when he marries in 1859. Now, Adelaide probably did die in 1843, but Catholic Church records are very, very detailed, and in each case, the priest notes in marriage records, in other kinds of records, whether the person is deceased or alive. So Adelaide is not listed as being deceased when her daughter gets married, when her son drowns accidentally, when her son marries, when her second son marries. So, did she really die? Yes, I think she probably did. In 1853, here again, before their marriage, they are listed, Augustin and Julie are listed as godparents for Henriette's daughter. So when did Augustin file the paperwork to have his wife legally declared dead? There had to have been some paperwork, and I have not yet been able to find that information. So more work for me to do, but oh, the webs and tangles that we weave. So this is not a direct line ancestor, I might add. I'm glad that he's off on the side. So this brings up some interesting questions. Do we share this kind of research? And how do we share this research? You have to look, are these old skeletons that, are people from long ago, 1850s, sure. We all have skeletons. That's not going to hurt anybody probably today. Or is it a new skeleton? Is it something that is happening in your lifetime that may be detrimental to the family? And you have to evaluate that impact that it might have. Some things are left better unsaid. Other things are important to share. We have, if there's a history of alcoholism, something like that might be important to share so that people can get treatment earlier. If you are going to share, consider your point of view and the tone in which you're going to expose the information, and what kinds of lessons can be learned from these people. I had a woman several years ago in my beginners class who had written a family history. She was doing 2 volumes. She had already completed the first volume, and the second volume was going to be from the Civil War forward. She had her father do a DNA test. And her father obviously was still alive, but he was like 90 years old. And it came back that he was not related to anyone in the family. And she wanted to know what to do about this particular situation. Number one, should she even tell her father, who was 90 years old at the time? Should she publish the volume? So she had this quandary. So, apropos of sharing information, Betty Richard taught the beginner's genealogy class for the Fort Worth Genealogical Society and wrote this little Genealogy 101 handbook. And in it, she's got a very humorous example on sharing. The Smiths were proud of their family history. Their ancestor had come to America on the Mayflower. Their line had included senators and Wall Street wizards. Now they decided to compile their family history, a legacy for their descendants. They hired a fine writer, experienced in writing family genealogies. Only one problem arose: how to handle that great uncle who was executed in the electric chair. The author said he could handle that chapter of history tactfully. The book appeared, and it said, Great Uncle George occupied a chair of applied electronics at an important government institution. He was attached to his position by the strongest of ties, and his death came as a real shock. So you can finesse it. So who's your skeleton? And what kind of research are you going to do? And how are you going to share it? So I leave that question with you. Do you all have any questions for me? So, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and the opportunity to speak. And happy Thanksgiving to everyone.